Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with veteran jazz pianist and composer Bruce Barth. He opened up about his new 2023 project and show, Fly with the Wind, featuring Terell Stafford, Tim Warfield, and the great Dick Oatts. The same lineup will join the Temple University Symphony Orchestra, Studio Orchestra, and Jazz Band to explore an eclectic mix of classical, jazz, and crossover music at Jazz at Lincoln Center's Frederick P. Rose Hall on Sunday, April 16th, 2023. Bruce has been sharing his music with listeners the world over for more than 25 years. In addition to traveling widely performing his own music, he has also performed with revered jazz masters, performing over 125 recordings with movie soundtracks and a lot in between. He's a great cat with wonderful stories. Enjoy this interview.
It's great to connect with you. It's great that you have ties to Kansas City, and I'm really looking forward to kind of delving in to your new work and what you've been up to. But before we do that, you know, the COVID-19 thing really rocks the music world. I'm curious how you survived it, you know, and how it's changed the way that you approach things now that the world's waking up.
It's a great question. You know, the COVID thing, I was fortunate because on one hand, of course, you know, not being, it was, when I look back on it, I can't believe that the city was closed down. I live in New York City. I live in East Harlem. And I just have been thinking about this recently. It's hard to believe that everything was closed. Unthinkable. The amount of time we spent home, not being able to play for people. What made me feel fortunate was that I teach at Temple University. Partly the connection with I think one of the things maybe we're talking about today is this Fly with the Wind project with the sextet.
Yeah.
But so fortunately, I was able to keep teaching online, which I think a lot of us were Zoom weary by the end of the process. But still, I felt very lucky to be able to keep doing that. And I played some online concerts. And I think the thing that benefited me was I had a lot of time to practice. And I've spoken to some other musicians. I think it could go either way. Some people were really depressed and didn't even want to play their instruments or touch, which I completely understand. And then some people probably had more time to practice than they had had since college, you know, since days when we were first coming up. So I was grateful for that, and I wrote a lot of music during that period. So I tried to make the best that I could out of it. But of course, it was really hard not being able to play for people and not being able to be in the community of musicians. So I'm grateful that that's come back. And, very grateful that it's come back.
I think the things that, from my perspective, I did so many interviews with musicians, and I think overwhelmingly there was a positivity which is just emblematic of the jazz community. But I think now, seeing how all of these projects are coming about, you know, people are doing like Fly with the Wind, for instance. You're with an all-star ensemble. It has to feel good to reemerge and to be around, you know, really great musicians and to be able to be back at it. How does it feel?
That feels great. I mean, it feels great. I love that Temple community. I've had very close ties to Terell Stafford. I think initially I hired Terell. I hired Terell for gigs. Terell brought me into Temple over 20 years ago, well over 20 years ago. And initially I hired Terell for gigs, and this is going back into the early 2000s. And I've been in his band, in his quintet now for probably getting close to 20 years. And we've played on each other's records. He's a close friend and one of my closest collaborators for the past. It's a long history, 2 decades. So Terell had the idea about 4 or 5 years ago to make a recording with members of the faculty. And he honored me with the task of writing all the music, writing and arranging all the music. So we put this together with Tim Warfield, tenor sax, Dick Oatts, alto. And this recent project is our second project, our second recording as a sextet. And the idea was to honor, that was my original music. The recent project was to honor Philadelphia musicians, as you may very well know. Temple's in Philly, and Philly just has such a rich jazz history through the decades. And so we wanted to do a project honoring Philly musicians. So Terell, again, he gave me free rein to choose the material. So I chose 4 great Philly composers: Lee Morgan, McCoy Tyner, Jimmy Heath, John Coltrane. Doesn't really get better than that. And the title track is "Fly with the Wind," which we're going to be playing at Lincoln Center Sunday night as part of there's a big concert featuring Temple's big band, the Symphony Orchestra, and the Sextet will be featured on this one tune.
And I talked to Terell about it, and it's so wondrous. I mean, just the magnitude and the stage that you'll be on. And I'm curious to dig a little bit back into your history. What was the first live jazz show that you ever saw that really made you think either I want to see this all the time or I want to be on that stage one day?
That's a great question. I don't think I had a eureka moment like that, but I love jazz, and I think in high school I went to a few shows, and I saw, my first favorite pianist was Oscar Peterson, and I remember seeing during high school, I went to a couple shows with Oscar and even Ella Fitzgerald on the same bill. We're going back to the mid-'70s. And then I remember my first teacher was Norman Simmons, a wonderful jazz pianist, who actually passed very recently. So this is by now I was probably in my late teens, early 20s, and I used to go, Norman was a mentor to me, and I would sometimes go hear his gigs. He was playing a lot around New York in those days, and I would go to hear him play. And I think it was sometime around then that I'd always loved music. I played classical piano as a kid and always played by ear and always improvised. But then when I heard jazz, I guess that maybe the real epiphany wasn't a live show as much as when I was 15, my brother gave me Mose Allison's Backcountry Suite. It was a birthday present. It was my first jazz record. Actually, these days, with jazz education, people are getting into it, and with YouTube, it's amazing how people are learning at a very young age. Of course, we didn't have YouTube. We didn't have much internet. We didn't have internet in those days. So my brother gave me the record, and I still remember it was. To this day, I love the record, trio record. Just a suite of short songs with very catchy melodies and nice grooves. And so I remember sitting down at the piano and trying to figure them out. So in my early years, I mentioned Norman as my first jazz teacher because I was largely self-taught as a jazz musician, just trying to learn things off records. And in some ways, it was it's a slower process these days. I mean, teaching at Temple, we have freshmen coming in. I just met someone online. I gave him a Zoom lesson, and I couldn't believe how accomplished he is. Senior in high school, just with a lot of knowledge of the jazz tradition. Back then, for me at least, it was a little slower. It was a slower process. I don't regret the process. It was fun. It was great. And if you wanted to hear music, you might hear something on the radio, and then you'd say, God, I'd love to hear that. So you'd have to get the record. It's not like instant access to the whole history of recorded jazz, which is an amazing thing happening now. Back then it had its advantages too. It kind of meant something. If you really wanted to hear a certain record, you have to get yourself down to the record store and buy it. It meant a lot. So the current state is great too. I'm not devaluing that at all, but it was meaningful that you had to go out and buy the record, get the record, physically go to the record store, which kind of gave it a certain kind of meaning and importance.
I'm curious over your career, you've been around a lot of legends and luminaries, and you're in an educational capacity now. What did you learn from the legends and luminaries that you gigged with that you in turn teach students these days?
That's a great question, Joe. One thing I will say about the legendary players I played with, they didn't really talk a lot about the music. Now, of course, as a teacher, you do talk more about the music. But I think there's one thing that happens when you play with the older cats is that, what Duke Ellington, of course, called the feeling of jazz, and he's not the only person to call it that. But just say being on the bandstand with Stanley Turrentine, I don't think he ever said a word to me about the music, about how to play. But just being on the bandstand, first of all, of course, it's such an honor. Somebody like Stanley Turrentine. But I just remember the sound of his tenor and the feeling behind the music. So when I say the feeling of jazz, the way he felt the time, the way his ideas flowed. You know, every master, they have such strong voices and musical conceptions and personalities. So you get a lot from that. And there's something I feel that's kind of lucky to have had the opportunity to play with some of those older people, is that you absorb a certain feeling for the music from playing with them. And it's a feeling for the music. Maybe it's about the feel, the time feel, the rhythm, the swing. And maybe it's also about how you tell a story, which people don't talk about that as much these days. When you take a solo, you're trying to tell a story. And so that's when you think about some of the... I've been fortunate to play with some great storytellers, some no longer with us. Stanley Turrentine, Freddie Hubbard, James Moody, Tom Harrell were some of the older. Tom still, of course, he's still with us and playing beautifully. But just the chance to play with those people and sometimes talk to them about the music, even though they wouldn't really, none of them said how to play, do this, do that. And I've been fortunate to collaborate with some really fine contemporaries. You mentioned Terell earlier. I have a very long relationship with Steve Wilson. I've been playing many years with him. And I've learned, and Terence Blanchard was really my first full-time touring gig back when I think there was a lot more touring going on. It's really harder to put a tour together these days than it was back in the early 90s, because I think there were a lot more clubs that had multiple nights. You could go into a city for a week. And that's becoming exceedingly rare, I'm sorry to say. There are very few venues, including New York. Used to have several venues where you could play a 5-6 night engagement. And now the clubs break up the week for financial reasons. So in terms of passing things on to my teacher, I hope they absorb. I hope some of my experiences are a part of me that they absorb. And I do often talk about some of the experiences and things I've learned. And I've learned a lot from my contemporaries too. People, when I mentioned Terell, Steve Wilson, Terence Blanchard, I've learned a lot from all of them also.
Kind of follow up, the thing about your career is that the hallmark has been your longevity, and you've evolved, and you always keep it fresh and keep it fluid. What has been your key to longevity? How have you stayed so relevant and evolved in this jazz craft?
Thank you, Joe. That's kind words. I think that the key is just to really take care of the music. There's an old saying, I don't know who said it, you take care of the music will take care of you. So I try in every situation just to do my best to prepare the music. I've tried to keep improving. I think my colleagues I mentioned, we're all pretty dedicated. We feel like, first of all, the jazz masters have set such a high bar that we strive to do the best we can. And it's one thing that's joyful about being a jazz musician is the learning just never ends. Sometimes I feel like I'm just scratching the surface as a player and also as a composer. I'm just trying to persist with writing music. Sometimes with the busy life, we don't have as much time to practice and write, but I try to set the time aside for that. It's really important. So I think the longevity is just being dedicated and trying to keep improving and then taking care of business. And I'm not necessarily the utility person. I don't necessarily want to stay super busy playing every night with different people. I want to really play with musicians that I have a relationship with, where the gig is meaningful to me. That's important.
So, the one thing, too, about dedicating your life to this music is that you obviously love it So very simply put, why do you love jazz?
The thing I love about jazz is, it's a great question. I love the feeling of the music. I love the rhythm and I love the sound. I love the feeling of a rhythm section. I love the sound of horns. I love the sound of a fine singer. And for me, jazz just gives you the chance to tell your story. Sometimes I'll just be at a gig sometimes and I'm just thinking, God, I love this, hearing people tell their story. It's exciting, whether it's an original tune or a standard, hearing people you're able to just really say what you're feeling in the moment. And I feel that's beautiful. And there's not really, there are other styles of music that involve improvisation. But for me, I guess it's that combination of being able to improvise, tell your story in the moment with just this rich legacy, this rich history. And I love the rhythmic feeling of the music, and I love the sound of the instruments. And I think when things are at their best, you're making the music together. You're telling your story, but it's always in relationship to your bandmates. And that, I think, is really the joy of the music. We're creating this together. We're interacting. We're listening. And I think that's one thing that comes with musical maturity. I'm not saying that it always takes a long time for people to develop this, but a lot of times younger musicians, they're more focused on themselves. Not in a selfish way, but there's a lot to think about. Taking care of business, making sure you're playing the chord changes if it's that kind of a situation, making sure your time is good, just playing the music correctly. So I put correctly in parentheses, in quotation marks rather. And then I think as you get a little more comfortable with your playing and your craft, then there's more mental space available to really be there in the moment, listening to your colleagues. And for me, that's really the joy, listening to the people you're playing with. And I get a lot of ideas. A lot of times I can get to a place where I'm not thinking anymore, let me take a good solo, but rather let me just connect with the band, And I love playing trio, and I also love playing with horns. Trio's wonderful, and it's great playing with horns. Playing in Terell Stafford's quintet, I get to not only solo, but I get to comp for two of my favorite horn players, Terell Stafford, truly, and Tim Warfield on tenor saxophone. Truly some of the finest musicians working today in the music. So it's a real joy. It's fun. It's a challenge. It's fun. There's a lot of freedom. And you do your best. You prepare your best. I think you prepare in a couple ways. On one hand, you're preparing yourself for being a musician by playing your instrument as well as you can. And I'm constantly trying to discover new things in the music. That's kind of what makes it exciting. And that's what I'm always encouraging my students to do. Not only learn from the tradition, but discover something. Sometimes you can take an idea from one of the masters and then say, okay, well, let's say you play a line by Charlie Parker, for instance. And it's a great exercise sometimes to transpose that line. And not only with the notes, but to play it try to imitate Bird's phrasing, touch, and feel. I sometimes see people transposing things on the internet mechanically. And the whole idea, something I got from actually a very important teacher of mine, Sophia Rossoff, who was actually a classical teacher, was every time you sit at the piano, you want the music to sound as beautiful as it can. So she actually didn't even like the word technique, because technique sometimes implies facility apart from the music. Sometimes it implies that. I think with fine musicians, it's in the surface of the music. So, but I will actually encourage people, not only, okay, you learn a Bird line idea, now take that idea, and it's great to learn that and to practice that idea, but then do something of your own with it. It might be a rhythmic part of it, the way the melody twists and turns. make up your own line inspired by Charlie Parker, but that you can really say is your own. Similarly, or conversely, just come up with a little idea. It could be a little harmonic idea, a shape. I'm constantly trying to find new things that are personal, that I haven't necessarily heard before. So I don't see myself as an innovator in the music, but personal, trying to find things that are my own. So I practice a lot of my own ideas. I've spent many hours and hours practicing the ideas of those musicians I respect, admire, and love. But then a lot of my time is spent developing my own ideas. And I've had a couple times where my fellow musicians have said, "Bruce, I heard you on the radio, and I knew it was you." And to me, that's kind of a high compliment to me. It means that I'm doing something that's personal, and I think it's something you don't set out to say, "Well, I'm gonna really find my own identity, my own voice." But it's just a slow, gradual process that happens from studying the things that you love, embracing the things that you love, and then developing your own ideas based on that.
I love that answer. Bruce, I want to make sure everyone out there knows about the 16th, knows about the music and the live show. If you could just let everybody know where they can find more information, get involved, anything revolving around the event.
Oh, thank you very much, Joe. This is Temple University night at Rose Hall. And if you go on the website of Jazz at Lincoln Center, you'll find this listed. So it's a big concert. It features really the orchestra, the big band. It's kind of a special occasion when they're working together. There are two commissions of composers, Billy Childs and Bill Cunliffe. And they're really ambitious and I think beautiful pieces. So those involve both the orchestra, the big band, and then the Bill Cunliffe piece, which is called Rainforest. It also involves the jazz sextet. And there will be a feature, the jazz sextet's being featured as well. We're going to do my arrangement of Fly with the Wind by the great McCoy Tyner.
Bruce, this has been so good to catch up with you. I've played your music for years. I've been a big fan, so it's an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for taking time out. I appreciate it.
Joe, thank you so much, and I look forward to hearing more of your fine shows and interviews. I really appreciate the beautiful work you've been doing for so many years.
Thanks for listening and tuning into another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players and minds in Philadelphia, New York City, Kansas City, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. Thanks to Bruce for his time, energy, and cool. If you want to hear more interviews, you can find Neon Jazz interviews on either Apple Podcast or Spotify. You can subscribe to us at YouTube, and for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.